So, because I don't know about you, I'm on the live stage, the main stage at Funding the Commons, which is up 2 flights of Spinal Tap, Hello Cleveland-like stairs at 12:20. So,
So say, Jel, give us the signal at 12:15 for sure.
Yeah. So I may literally mic drop, but I think one of the things that we have in common is that we've done real-world grants, right? So tell me a little bit about your experience in that space.
Yeah, so I'm here. I've been full-time in the crypto space since 2017 and started a large community in Chicago where we did some funding there. And then started at Gitcoin in 2020. I worked for a little over 3 years with Gitcoin, helping with grants operations. I'm running civil detection for a long while. And we also did a lot of the grant eligibility and creating of like rules for participation in that. And then in the last year and a half, I've been working with Arbitrum to install the first pluralistic grants program there. And so we've given 500 some grants in 22 rounds with 22 different funding mechanisms over the last year.
So when you say pluralistic, do you mean you're trying different strategies, or?
Yeah, fundamentally, we think that there's not one way to fund everything. The way you would fund hiring a service provider or somebody who works at City Hall is different than the way you'd fund filling in potholes or giving subsidies to gas stations and grocery stores to exist where they don't. So when you build this economy.
And I think that's one of the first lessons is that the texture of the market, like people say, you will be amazed by how much detail reality has, right? And I think one of the things you come in and you've got a sort of general optimizing function in the back of your mind, but it turns out that reality is a lot more complicated, right?
Yeah, one of the things we learned at Gitcoin was, there's this optimal mathematic system, in quadratic funding, and then you find out that there's a lot of assumptions that come into play, right? And you don't know all of those assumptions. Some of them are clear, like it needs to be a Sybil-free round for it to work. Some of them are less clear, like, oh no, we used a sortition mechanism that kind of preferences people at the beginning who get the first initial donations.
I thought you were going to say at the beginning of the alphabet, which is like another one of those things, right? Where you just go, oh shit, we've introduced
We had to do something. So no matter what we chose, there was going to be a bias in our system. So like where theory meets implementation, you see a lot of issues. And I think that's kind of where we wanted to take this, was a little bit of like, from your vantage point in the ecosystem, what's been hard and difficult for this community to, when it comes to steering such a large economy and, where theory meets implementation and getting things.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that I'm really interested to see, like, where your experience comes from this, which is one of the things that Juan talked a bit about, like, optimizing for the time and expense of the process itself, right? And one of the things that causes unknown expense is, one, the complexity of it, right? Like, we have a lot of people thinking and working on retro PGFs and things like that, and that's both a opportunity cost and a cost, right? The other thing is like building up the institutions. So one of the things that I'm just going to stick this in early because it's the number one thing I think is that the people who should get money aren't necessarily the people who, in fact, often are not the people optimized for finding and getting money, right? And so you get these sort of like amazing super evolved leopards of grant receiving who immediately pounce on you because you're running a grants program and they know how to write the whole thing. And I'm going, you're great, but honestly, I'm not worried about you getting money, right? Like, you're super good at this. I'm worried about the people who don't even know that we exist, or or an open source project who would benefit from money, but there's no money spigot hole to pour it into, and like trying to make those connections seems to be both the biggest cost burden for grants programs and kind of also the biggest sort of unsolved challenge.
Yeah, I think many of us has had this experience in a more like personal human way, where you go into a meeting and there's 10 people and there's 2 of them are just the loudest, right? And a lot of meetings run or function.
That's literally us.
It is, right? A lot of them function in that way where like the loudest voice is heard, right? And you can compare this in ecosystem setting to the ones who have the most access to marketing, have built up the most brand, the biggest ones. But like, if we want to actually solve for funding the upstarts, right? And like new novel mechanisms rather than forks of other mechanisms, we have to be very explicit about that in the way we create eligibility criteria and participation. And that's where the pluralism comes in a lot, is that you're very specific, whatever your objective function is. So somebody mentioned the 50 million reward program that Arbitrum had run, and they didn't specify very much like, well, are we trying to get the most, like, grab the most whales of over $2 million, or are we trying to increase the total number of users, right? So by specifying that function and then diving in a little deeper, now we could look at the data and say, is it perps or dexes or lending protocols that specifically worked best for that? And then we can set like a criteria for participation, right? So if we were looking for upstarts and new companies, you know, the non-forked ones, it doesn't mean that everything that your ecosystem funds should be that way, right? So how does your ecosystem legitimize, as Juan was showing, one mechanism that sort of serves as like the executive function of setting like ecosystem-wide strategy and objectives, and put that on chain? And then how do you leverage expertise to understand what sub-programs might be funded within any specific objective function or domain? That's really the issue we've had, is trying to do one grant program to then end fund everything, when you actually need different competencies at the strategic and tactical execution layers. And then you need the operational function to connect those that you didn't need in a centralized system.
Yeah. I think one of these things is that you do get, the complexity of reality ends up getting reflected in the complexity of the system that you're building, right? And so one of the things I worry about a lot in a grants program is that I'm effectively exporting a lot of that complexity back to the applicants, right? Like there's just this thing where I go, oh, now they're having to navigate this whole thing. I'm asking them questions like, what is your impact? Please give me a number between 0 and 10. And I'm like going, I don't even know what that is, let alone what they do.
But that feeling of like the complexity growing is almost a signal that you actually don't know what you're measuring or doing.
Oh, interesting.
Right? And so like, I think of like a kind of like the beautiful simplicity of like the way like Steve Jobs put like product together, right? Like there's a, once you really know what you're doing in that ecosystem and you're trying to solve for a very specific objective function, it becomes a lot clearer whether or not you're working towards that thing. And a lot of times I think we mask the fogginess or vagueness of what we're trying to do because we didn't spend enough time at the outset defining that objective function. So we end up trying to solve it on the back end by involving a lot of complexity and being able to analyze and figure out if we did something, when at the beginning we could have just said, I want to measure if this took 3 steps forward or 3 steps backwards, right? I don't want to figure out a new way to measure like if you're taking steps.
So you quoted sort of Steve Jobs and this idea of like, you know, building in clarity into these systems. And one of the quotes someone showed me in the bar earlier this week from Steve Jobs is like, you have to say no like 1,000 times, right, to get that kind of certainty. When you're giving grants, like saying no always feels a bit like a failure, right? Like it feels like here is somebody, particularly when somebody needs money, or like, you know, it's a good project, right? It just doesn't quite fit into your grants program. How do you reconcile that? How do you get focus in what you're doing? Do you just say, we are going to try and nail this particular narrow grants area? Or is it, like you say, to come up with a mechanism to assess these things that you're happy with?
Well, I'm going to use a sports analogy that I'm completely underqualified to use. But you know, on any...
And I'm going to act like I understand it, so
right,
carry on.
right. So in any sports ball, you have a team of people with like different skills, right?
Allegedly.
And
yeah.
so when people come and they say like, I want to participate, there is a stage of qualifying and saying, well, which one of these positions would you be best at, right? And so saying no to one of the grantees is something you should track. How much are we saying no when we actually think that they're good and we just don't have a mechanism that's funding what they do, right? Do we need another program that is better at funding what they do? Or
right.
are they not the ones deserving of the grant for creating that outcome? Yeah. Right? And that's the specificity that, like, I think what we're saying is the simplicity is that if you can clearly state what goals you're going for, then you can also clearly state, well, you are at this point in line for getting a grant for doing that. Here's the other applications, and here's the method that we're fairly using to prioritize.
That's a fascinating point. I'd love to carry on talking to you, but I now have 30 seconds to run up 3 flights of stairs.
You can do this.
I can. Okay. All right. Well, we'll set up a prediction market on it. Thanks very much. Can you give this to Shia? Because I got to run.
Thanks, Denny.